Right, a short history of harmonic tuning. Most of you, well, all of you will have rung on bells that are harmonically tuned, and you will have rung on plenty of rings of bells which are what we call old style. So they have sharp hums and often flat fundamentals. Now, a modern bell, a middle C, is about 5 foot, 5'1" in diameter, and weighs about 2 to just over 2 and a bit tons. And if you look at the octave notes, you can see how they double up. So we've got the hum at 130, fundamental at 260, nominal at 520. The fifth or quint is 3 times the hum, so it's 390. And the minor third is dependent on which tuning system you use, so how you calculate it. But a just tierce, just minor third, is 6/10 the nominal. So that's a typical modern bell. Now, in an old style bell, the hum note is nearly always sharp, and in English bells, they're typically between half a tone and a tone sharp, sometimes sharper still. And the fundamental is normally flat. In larger bells, it might only be slightly flat. It might be up to about half a tone flat. And in thick trebles, it can be 2 to 2.5 tones flat. Most larger bells sound a lot better than the smaller bells because of that. It's because the fundamentals in the trebles are very flat and they have this sort of meow effect, whereas the larger bells, the fundamentals tend to be only a bit flat, sometimes nearly in tune, and they sound much better. An exception, of course, would be Gloucester Cathedral tenor, where the fundamental is about 3/4 of a tone flat, and that's why the bell has this rather sort of gruff sound. But it's unusual to have bells of that size with fundamentals so flat. What I'm trying to find is a sound clip. Anyway, okay. If you look on the left-hand profile, that's a Warner bell from 1883. And if you look, it's fairly straight-waisted with a very large sound bone. The waist is quite narrow. That is why the hum note is sharp. And that is typical of 18th, 19th century English bells. The sharp hum because of a fairly narrow waist. If you look at the profile on the right, this is one of the bells at Downham in Essex, where I ring, and the Gillett and Johnston ring from 1946. And you can see the waist of the bell is much broader. There's still a bit of a flare to the sound bow, which gives this the just tierces that are noted in Gillett and Johnston bells, but there's a broader waist and therefore an octave hum. This is a diagram taken from my harpsichord showing you where the notes are on a keyboard. So if you look down here, we've got the hum note, C3, and then we've got C4, the second partial or fundamental. Then we've got the E flat, which is the minor third or tierce, G4, perfect fifth or quint, and C5, the nominal. So that's how they're distributed on a keyboard. But of course, the big difference is if you play that chord on a keyboard, the notes have about the same amplitude and decay rates. Whereas, of course, in a bell, it's the strike note, which is the dominant one initially. The hum swells up afterwards as the other partial tones die away. And that is a middle C bell. That is, in fact, bow tenor, which weighs 4,200 weights and was cast at Whitechapel in 1956. So that is a middle C bell. Now, in England, in the early 17th century, we had the beginnings of change ringing, and sets of 3 and 4 were being augmented to 5 and 6. And the only thing that was really required was that the bells went down what we call the diatonic scale, which is the scale we use today. There was nothing, there was no great demand on the bell sound, apart from the fact that the strike notes were reasonably well in tune. However, in the Low Countries at the same time, they were starting to build carillons. They'd gone off on a completely different route with their Lutheran churches. They wanted sets of bells for tune playing. The problem there, of course, is you cannot have bells with different hum ratios and variable fundamentals ranging from slightly flat to very flat and only approximately in tune strike notes. It demanded something more accurate. So the pressure was on to produce an accurately tuned instrument, and that pressure simply didn't exist in England. And in the early 1640s, the Harmonic brothers, Peter and Francois, along with Van Eyck, who was a blind musical philosopher and also composer, set about trying to discover the perfectly tuned bell. And what they did was they simply had numerous bells cast of different profiles. And as they got nearer and nearer, they were able to make small adjustments in the profile until they actually produced a bell which was in tune with itself. It had an octave hum, inline fundamental. It had a mean tone tierce because that's what they were aiming for, just fifth, and the nominal in tune. So having produced this model, this perfectly tuned bell, they then developed a formula to scale up that model or scale it down so that they could make bells of different sizes to exactly the same profile. So, and they would stick a little bit on for tuning tolerance. And if you look at the photograph on the right of some Harmonic bells, you can see where they've been lathe tuned. And what Harmonics did to tune their bells was they put large bells on a capstan lathe, and the capstan lathe was driven by horses, donkeys, or men, or combination of all three. It meant the bell rotated very slowly, but enabled them to machine metal off the inside surface to correct these partial tones in tune. And they use resonating bars. I don't know about you, but when I was at primary school, we used to have chime bars, and they were simply a flat plate on a resonator. And every now and again, when we did music, they pull these things out of the cupboard and we'd all sit and play them. Well, that's what the Harmonics had. They had resonating bars for tuning their bells. They only cast carillons up to about 3.5 octave because they could only make scale models. They didn't know how to make thick trebles. So if they went beyond about 3.5 octaves, their trebles were simply too weak. So they limited themselves to 3, sometimes 3.5 octaves. But they were able to tune their bells quite accurately, and they aligned the strike notes on what we call quarter comma mean tone, which was a standard tuning in the 17th century. And it's a system whereby of the 12 major thirds within an octave, 8 of them are perfectly in tune. So it was a very popular system with musicians and composers in the 17th century because all these in tune major thirds. Modern piano tuner tunes the piano so all the thirds are equally out of tune. So there are no good thirds. When I tune keyboard instruments, I use what is called a well-tempered tuning, where some of the thirds are nearly in tune and some are a bit more out of tune. But at least it means you have what we call tonal color for each key, rather than all the keys sounding the same. Mean tone is the same. All the good keys sound the same. So you've got some good keys, and then you've got some horrendously out of tune keys, which you avoid. But that's how they did it. And they carried on producing harmonically tuned bells, but at each successive generation, a little bit of information was lost. And by the early 19th century, it was lost altogether. They knew what shape to produce, it's just they no longer knew what to do with it. And I think one of the last really good carillons is Bruges, which was cast in 1725, I think, by Melchior de Haze. And even that required some retuning 40 years ago when it was restored. So that's what happened in the Low Countries, but there was no pressure in England to produce harmonically tuned bells. This is Harmony's profile that he developed. There is sometimes a little variation in height, but the basic profile remains the same. And this is one of Harmony's carillons. You hear the mean tone tuning, which is quite different from what you're used to, but that was the standard system, and it's still used today for performances of early Baroque works. Tuning in England. As I said, there was no pressure for the bell founders. All they had to do was produce a set of bells that, or additional bells, which were reasonably in tune. Some of the better founders produced some near harmonically tuned bells purely by accident, and that would include some by Miles Gray, some by Matthew Bagley, Joseph Smith of Edgbaston, and the Knight family of Reading. There was Dobson and Osborne and Dobson, of course, of Downham. They also produced some bells with near octave hums, and so did Rudhall. Rudhall's bells vary considerably, rather like Bilby's down in Somerset. Some of his bells have very sharp hums, well, over a tone sharp. Some of his bells have near octave hums, and certainly when I was tuning conventionally with internal tuning only, I had considerable different results with Rudhall bells, where sometimes I'd be hard pressed to get a flat seventh hum with it half tone sharp. Sometimes it was quite straightforward to tune the bell on the harmonic principle. Rudhall, like Whitechapel, had a formula whereby the thicker the scale, the taller the sound bone. And so some of you will have seen Rudhall bells with immensely tall sound bones, very short-waisted bells, huge sound bones, but they're usually thick trebles. His thinner scale bells, his larger bells, tend to have much shorter sound bones. And the Mears family did much the same. They developed a formula where thick trebles had much, much taller sound bones. They recognized that the partial tones were out of tune. They recognized the fact they didn't know what to do with them. So what they did with the trebles, understanding that the trebles were the worst bells, was to make an enormous sound bone, so you've got plenty of bang and little else. So at least you had a fairly powerful sound, and it tended to mask the very, very flat fundamentals and the sharp hums. There was a period of decline during the Napoleonic Wars and the Georgian era, and quite a number of bell founders disappeared off the scene altogether. Warners had a foray into bell founding in the 1780s, 1790s and stopped, and they restarted in the 1850s. Bryant cast bells up to about the 1820s until he retired. And by the Victorian era, there were very few founders left. Taylors were sort of on the ascendancy. Whitechapel were really reigning supreme, and Rudhall, of course, were in decline. There was no improvement in the early part of the Victorian era in bells. In fact, really, I think by the 1850s, 1860s, a lot of modern bells were worse than bells cast, say, a century before. If you were to take an average of hum notes, you would find the bells cast in the mid-19th century had sharper hums than the ones cast in the mid-18th century. So there was a deterioration. And Whitechapel were certainly to blame for that. They were producing far worse bells in the mid-19th century than they were in the mid-18th. And John Rudhall, of course, the last of the Rudhall founders, his bells are very variable indeed. Some of them are quite reasonable, and some of them are very poor, much, much worse than Thomas Rudhall or even Abraham. This is Earl's Cone in Essex. They're a typical Warner 8. The back six are cast in 1869, the two trebles 1908. They're a typical old style ring, sharp hums scattered about, varying between just over half a tone and a quarter sharp, and flat fundamentals. And this is the sound. Now compare that with a harmonically tuned ring in the same key. This is King Stainton in Devon, which are a classic Gillett and Johnston ring cast in 1929 and one of the best F heels in existence. Right, there you see the huge gulf between old style and harmonic tuning. By the 1890s, there was considerable pressure in the press, particularly in the Times, by people like Canon Arthur Simpson and Lord Rayleigh, saying what I've just said, that bells, modern bells were worse than the bells being cast over 100 years ago, and the technology existed to do something about it. If you look at this photograph of Whitechapel's old tuning machine, which was bought from Rudhall's foundry in 1844, you can see how crude it is. The bell is mounted stationary, and the machine revolved around the bell. It could only cut about halfway down the bell, about halfway down the waist. So although they could carry out some tuning, obviously you couldn't cut the bell all the way up. And this machine was typical of machines at the time. Taylor's machine looked very similar, so did Gillett Johnston's, so did Warner's. They all had these similar machines where a bell was clamped stationary and you could only cut the salvo and sort of partway down the waist. Now, in 1895, Taylor's were already scratching their heads, thinking, what can we do to discover this art of harmonic tuning? Because they knew it would be a world beater. If they could get there first, they could sell the idea of recasting bells simply so they could be tuned on the harmonic principle. And that's exactly what they did. In 1895, they ordered 3 new machines, a small turret lathe, a lathe that took them up to about 2.5 tons, and a big machine for tuning bells up to 15 tons, and all 3 of those machines still exist. They bought a set of calibrated tuning forks so that they could pitch bells accurately, and they started experimenting with shapes and harmonic tuning. They had an advantage over the other founders because they had already produced a number of bells which we would call near Simpson or near true harmonic. There was, for instance, at Great Malvern in Worcestershire, the tenor, which is 1887, only required a little bit of corrective tuning on the outside to put it in tune. So they were effectively a step ahead. They'd almost got their octave hum, and in their large bells, the fundamentals were only tending to be a bit flat. So they didn't have to make a radical difference in their shape in order to produce harmonically tuned bells. In 1896, with the new tuning machines installed, they sent out Newerby, where they'd augmented a 4 to 10. And of the 6 new bells, only 2 of them you could say are true harmonic. The other 4 aren't that far off. So they'd made quite rapid progress. And the same year, they did St Paul's Bedford, where they'd added 2 trebles and recast a tenor, and then recast most of the other bells in the same year. And then they sent out a complete harmonically tuned 8 at Norton in Sheffield in 1896. I couldn't find a decent recording one, unfortunately. They're very good. They're not perfect. There are a couple of bells where the fundamentals are a bit flat, but you don't really notice it when you ring all 8. But that was the great leap forward. They'd done it. They'd got there before anybody else. They'd rediscovered this lost art, which had been lost in the Low Countries for 100, 150 years. And they'd sent out a complete harmonically tuned ring. This is Canon Simpson's diagram from his pamphlet, Why Bells Sound Out of Tune. This was extremely unhelpful to bell founders. And it's fortunate for Taylor's that they managed to suss out exactly how tuning worked. He claimed that you flatten the fundamental by cutting. First of all, he'd come up with an idea that you cut the fundamental by cutting in the salvo and the waist, sort of C and G, and that you flatten the hum by cutting between A and B. Well, he got it completely the wrong way around. And in fact, it's zone A that flattens the fundamental, and H to C flattens the nominal, and C to B flattens the hum. Taylor's got that. Most of the other founders didn't. I suspect that they were misled by this, and I also suspect that they were misled further by what is known as the missing fundamental, and I'll explain that briefly. The nominal is often called the naming note because that's what determines the note of a bell, regardless of the position of the other partial tones. The nominal determines the note of the bell. And what you hear outside the tower or even in the ringing room is half the nominal. You can't pitch it, it's just not there. In a modern bell, of course, its equivalent is the fundamental because that's half the nominal frequency. But you can't pitch this strike note, this missing fundamental. And I suspect that most of the founders thought that the fundamental was self-correcting. There's a tuning, and that's Taylor's middle-sized machine from 1896, where they're just machining the head of a bell there, but that's when the machine was quite new. So Taylor's had got there in 1896. 1904, Charles Carr of Smethwick also started to try harmonically tuned bells. He got part of the way there. His problem was that although he seemed to make some progress in putting the harmonics in tune, he wasn't very good at putting the strike notes in tune. And at Highley, which is a job from 1907, the tenor is very, very flat. I mean, it should have been recast, but clearly he struggled. He'd made some progress and he was the second founder to try, but he never got there altogether. Then along came Gillett and Johnston in 1907. Cyril Johnston was only 22 years old. He'd been very successful at school, he'd been head boy, he was very good at sports, he was academic, and he could see the only way for his foundry to do well was to adopt this system. And he did some very rapid modernization. He poached Taylor's pattern designer to design his H castings and his headstock patterns, which is why Gillett and Johnston's early headstocks look like Taylor's. And he also discovered harmonic tuning very rapidly. And it came about because Gillett and Johnston had provided a clock chime to a school in Elstree, which were very much old style, and they'd complained about them. One of the teachers was a bell ringer, and he knew about this new harmonic tuning, so he suggested that Taylor's recast them. And Cyril Johnston wrote to the school and said, "Don't worry, we'll replace these bells free of charge. I just need a few weeks." And he came back a few weeks later and wrote to the school and said, "I've solved the problem." And in a matter of weeks, he'd learned how to make harmonically tuned bells, and they replaced the clock chime at Elstree. They're not perfect, but it was a great leap forward. And from there on, sort of Gillett and Johnston never really looked back. They started to produce harmonically tuned bells. And by 1910, they produced a ring of 8 for Oakham. And in 1911, they produced 2 rings of 10, Wimborne, Minster and Hillingdon, and their first complete harmonically tuned 12, which was for Wolverhampton. Dublin were already a 12, but of course from 2 different dates. The back 10 are 1897, the 2 trebles are 1909. So, but Gillett and Johnston produced the first complete harmonically tuned 12, all cast at one time in 1911 at Wolverhampton. Then along came Warners. Well, Warners were one of these foundries which struggled. They learned how to get the octave hum. They just never, ever really sussed out what to do with the fundamental. And if you look inside many of their early harmonically tuned bells, you'll see that they've been quite heavily cut in the waist and on the sound bow, but there's no cutting in the crown at all, absolutely none. So what they tended to do was cast their bells with the fundamental note perhaps a bit sharp, and in the course of tuning, it would get left further and further behind. So the bell actually deteriorated on the lathe. So at the end, they were producing these bells with fundamentals a tone and a quarter sharp. Llewellyn and James suffered the same problem. They didn't understand the fundamental either, probably confused by Simpson's diagram and by the missing fundamental, perhaps thinking it was a self-correcting partial, of course it's not. So Llewellyn and James never really got there. Alfred Bell pretended he knew harmonic tuning. There's a picture of his machine here, perfectly decent machine. Fred Bell was a musician, but quite frankly, he couldn't even get the strike notes in tune. He could just about cope with rings of 6, but his rings of 8, Malden was one. The 2 trebles were wildly out of tune. And only 5 years ago, I tuned them and put them in tune. So, but what he used to do was simply cut the bell all the way up and claim it was Simpson tuned, but often wrecking some of the harmonics in the process. The Whitechapel Bell Foundry, Mears and Steinbeck, seemed to resist the idea of harmonic tuning until really it couldn't hang on much longer. By the 1920s, some of Albert Hughes' friends were saying, if you don't get into harmonic tuning, you're finished. And so by 1923, they were starting to send out the very first harmonic tuned bells. They were small bells to start with. And it wasn't until 1927 that Whitechapel sent out 2 8s. One was a chime of 8 at Cinderford in Gloucestershire, and the other is the Good Shepherd Brighton, which is the first complete ring of 8. So they got there, but it was a slow process. Here is a Warner bell from 1913, have an octave hum, but the fundamental was a tone and a quarter sharp. You can see on the right the photograph. You can see where Warners had machined the bell from the sound bow right down into the waist, but there was no cutting in the crown at all. And this is what it sounded like to begin with. Horrible croaking noise, because the fundamental is so sharp, it's only slightly flat of an octave with the minor third. And so you've got a clash with the minor third and this horrible croaking noise. But I wasn't able to get it completely in tune because there wasn't enough crown thickness, but I did get it down over just over a tone, and this is what it sounds like. See, minor difference, still not in tune. And if you listen carefully, you could hear a wobble between the fundamental and the hum. You hear that whoa, 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 because that fundamental was still sharp. It wasn't exactly an octave, but it was a lot flatter than it was. This is Chelmsford Cathedral. These were cast by Warners in 1913. They're a complete 12, and in my opinion, probably the worst 12 in existence. Some people quite like them. I've rung more peals on this wretched 12 than any other 12, and I can't say that I've ever grown fond of them. A familiar croaking noise from the back bells. The only decent bells, in fact, are 6, 5, and to some extent the 4th. And that's purely by accident, because as the bells were getting thicker, the fundamentals were becoming less sharp. But they're a strange sounding 12. They sound quite angry. They're not easy to hear either, because you've got this clash of harmonics. There's nothing really is in tune in these bells, and it's not a happy sound at all. So Warners tried and failed. Only in about 1921, 22, right near the end of their existence as bell founders, they did carry on making other things. They gave up making bells, that they finally suss out how to tune the fundamental. And they sent out a Carillon in 1922 to Stavanger, which I've still yet to visit, but apparently is quite respectable. When bell founders got to grips with harmonic tuning, and really we're talking about Whitechapel, Gillett, Johnson, and Taylors, it was quite natural that they would also turn their attentions to tuning old bells and see what they could do with those. The most radical, of course, was Gillett and Johnson, especially in their early days. They did some quite radical tuning to old rings, trying to flatten the hums towards an octave, with the result that sometimes the bells got very thin in the waist. So although the bell was reasonably in tune with itself, it had little in the way of guts. There's a limit to what you can do, given the old style profile. There's a limit to what you can do to flatten the hum. You can cut the bell in the waist and flatten the hum to some extent, but clearly thickness is an issue. In the 1980s and early 90s, Meeks Watson, American company, started to tackle Manili bells by tuning on the outside. Manili bells are worse than Victorian English bells. They have horrendously sharp hums and horrendously flat fundamentals. And Meeks Watson thought, well, the only way to tackle these wretched things is to cut the outside, because it raises the fundamental and it flattens the hum. And Manili bells have enormous sound bows, so you can just keep carving away quite happily, whilst the hums go down and the fundamentals go up. And that's exactly what they did. I wanted to introduce it into England. I thought it would be controversial. I was convinced that people would get very upset by the idea. And then in about 2012, Nicholson's had an order to rehang a Warner 8 up in Barrow. They wanted them recast because they were so awful, but they couldn't afford it. So I said, would you accept external tuning? And they said, anything to make these bells better. So that's what we did. And that was the first serious attempt. And it made a dramatic improvement to what was a very miserable 8, rather like the ones at Earlstown that you heard earlier. I'm presently tuning a Warner 8 from All Saints Eastbourne. They're about 1800 weight 8, and they cast in 1883. This is the 6th, which I was tuning the other day, and this is what I was able to achieve. This is before. And this is after. So we have a bell with this typical Victorian bell with a hum note was about 3/4 of a tone sharp, and the fundamental was about 1/2 a tone flat. And by cutting on the outside, I was able to raise the fundamental, flatten the hum, do some corrective tuning inside, and we now have a bell that's in tune with itself. So the octaves are properly in tune, the minor third is properly in tune, and I think the 5th harmonic quint is just slightly sharp. But that's the difference you can make. And with internal tuning, you simply cannot attain that level of improvement. If I had cut the bell internally, I could have flattened the hum, and I could have got it down to a flat 7. So I would say, 3/4 of a semitone sharp of an octave. But in flattening the hum, I'm also flattening the fundamental. That's getting lower all the time because you cannot adjust any of these partial tones individually. So although I would have got a flatter hum, which would have given the bell a little bit more body, a bit more oomph, the fundamental would have remained at least 1/2 a note flat, if not a little bit more. But with this external tuning, I was able to put the bell properly in tune. So I think it was in November 19 where I was tuning Elkstone whites. Elkstone were a very interesting mix. There was a 1977 old style Whitechapel treble, which was actually quite poor. There was a Whitechapel 4th, which was a Simpson bell, a harmonic detuned bell, was actually much better. And I scratched my head and wondered why on earth they put an old style treble on when there was already a modern harmonic detuned bell. And the second of the 6 was a bell by Thomas Bond, which he'd cast in 1927. And it was beat ridden and gutless. And there's only so much you can do about beats or wobbles. but this is what it sounded like before it was tuned. It sounds quite miserable, doesn't it? And it's also very gutless. And the reason it's gutless is when we, of course, we machined the sound bow, we found out why, because it's extremely porous. But we did what we could, and we did at least put the bell in tune with itself. So it's gained a bit more oomph than it had. It's still got some wobbles. They're not quite so bad as they were, but the bell is at least a bit brighter because the bell is now in tune with itself. That, I think, is a summary. That's the history of harmonic tuning. As I say, most bell founders try, apart from Bow with his just cutting bells all the way up, most bell founders at least tried harmonic tuning, and really the ones that failed went out of business, and the ones that succeeded, which were Whitechapel, Taylors and Gillets, continued. Llewellyn and James had stopped making bells certainly by about 1924, as had Carrs of Smethwick, but Carrs carried on rehanging bells certainly until after the Second World War, but they'd stopped making bells by about 1924-25. Warner's stopped in about 1922, and a branch of the Warners went off to America. They seem to prefer to make things like cast iron bars, taps, and valves than bells. So that's really what happened. It was a case of, if you got into harmonic tuning, you stayed, and if you didn't, you went. Bond survived up till about 1939-40, and he retired and died not long after. And the same happened with Bell. Bond never tried harmonic tuning. He had an extremely crude tuning machine, and he had no idea how to tune bells, so he never even tried. But he managed to sort of limp on into the 30s doing rehang jobs, and some of his bells, of course, were bought from Gillett and Johnston rather than cast himself. Bowell, of course, did quite well, not so much because of his bells, but because of his hanging. It was basic, a bit crude with his girder headstocks, but he was quite a successful bell hanger, so he managed to carry on until the late 1930s. But he only cast, his last ring of 8 was at Malden in 1922, which, as I say, were a complete disaster until they were tuned a few years ago. He was much better at hanging bells than he was at casting and tuning. But really, that's a summary of the history of harmonic tuning and how we ended up where we are today. And I'm now an independent consultant, and this is the picture of me standing with the Anzac bell, which I went out to tune 3 years ago. Anyway, that's it. And I'd invite anybody with questions. I hope there's some questions. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. It was extremely interesting and very informative, based on clearly years of experience. While people are thinking about questions, I had one myself. In a lot of the photographs that you show, a majority of the tuning is being done on a lathe, either with the bell stationery or the lathe stationery. Lathes are a relatively recent discovery. I know bells were tuned with a chisel, am I correct in saying, prior to lathes being used? Is that correct? And if so,
it is correct, yes. They either used a hammer and chisel or a chipping hammer. And that was certainly the common practice until the 19th century. I'm not sure what year Rudhall installed his machine, but certainly it was around about 1805, because there are Rudhall bells after that date with machining marks. And Harrison, the radical clockmaker and bell founder, also had a machine for tuning his bells in the 1790s, 1800s. But his machine, the bell actually revolved. That was quite unique at the time. Rather more like the Hemonies, because their machines were designed so the bell actually revolved.
Hi, Joel. Chris Pickford reckons it was around 1790 that the Rudhall machine was put into was put in. There isn't an accurate date, but that's around the date.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me that, because I've often wondered, and the only evidence I've ever managed to pick up is by looking in Rudhall bells to see if they've been chip-tuned or lathe-tuned. And I've certainly found bells after 1805, but I've not seen any earlier, but he presumably has.
Well, interestingly, there's a ring at Forthampton near where we are, where the third, the third was recast in 1824, but it is hand tuned. Now, when I was talking this with Chris Pickford, we thought maybe at that time, of course, Rudhall was just supplying a bell, and because you didn't have any means of actually knowing what you were matching it to, you probably put it in the tower first and then tried to make it sound a bit better, which was why in 1824 it might have been chip tuned potentially. It's the only one of that date. But so you do, the fact that it's chip tuned doesn't mean that he didn't have necessarily a tuning machine. So.
Oh no, not by any means. It was quite common in those days to adjust the strike note within the works, and then having got it into the tower to find further tuning was necessary. So the tuner would be dispatched with his chipping hammer or his hammer and chisel to do further tuning. So that wasn't unusual. They didn't have any accurate pitching devices. At Whitechapel, they were probably a bit ahead of the game in a way, because what they used to do was to take a set of blank tuning forks, quite crude ones, and file one until it matched the tenor. And from that, they would then make one. Let's say they were going to recast a third. The third of a six was cracked. So they would make a fork to match the tenor. And then, having got back to the works, they would then make another fork, which was the fourth interval above the tenor, and tune the new bell to that. And then, if necessary, they would carry out further tuning in the tower. But usually that system worked reasonably well. And they went on further with that system, because they would make up a complete set of forks for a new ring. And they would always have their own individual set. They would start with the flattest bell, make a fork to match it, and then the musical bod in the works would make a complete set of forks to go round it to tune all the other bells. And they used to keep them in oiled brown paper. And if a bell cracked or they wanted additions, they used to get out these forks, make more forks to match, and then tune the new bells to suit. And that's how they did it until they bought their own set of calibrated forks. But it wasn't uncommon to have to do additional cutting in the machining, or tuning rather, in the tower.
So that rough tuning you were talking about, rough tuning forks, what period are we talking about? Is that the early 19th century or later?
Yes, yes, early 19th. I've got some from certainly from the 1840s.
Yeah, because tuning forks were sort of started to be, well, accurate ones were the mid 19th century, weren't they?
Yes, so, yeah. Yes, that's right. And that's one of the things that was being cited in the Times by the 1890s, the fact that there were good quality vertical boring machines for tuning bells and calibrated tuning forks were available.
Thank you very much. Question-wise, I can see there's quite a few people waiting who've unmuted themselves. I think the best bet, I will, if you could, I can't see everybody on my screen, but if you could wave at me when you have a question, I will try and come to you. Mark, I think you were next.
Well, I was just going to follow up that point, actually. So are you saying, Nigel, that in the 19th century, if they were augmenting a ring or they were recasting, they'd leave the old bells in the tower and then cast the new bells and try and match them remotely, as it were? Because, I mean, surely today, most of the time, you take all the bells out and bring them back to the foundry, do you not?
Oh, well, if we're going to tune them, yes. But if it's an existing ring that's only going to be augmented, all I do is go up the tower with my mobile phone, record each bell, and then analyze the partial tones on my laptop and work out a tuning spec. If they're coming back for tuning, of course, it's different matter, but you've still got to get some idea what you're going to tune them to, so you know what spec to make the bells.
I suppose so, yeah. I suppose quite often, you know, you are, even if you're only recasting or augmenting, you are going to do a little light tune on a lot of them, aren't you? That's the normal thing, isn't it?
It is. It is. I'm augmenting an existing ring, an old ring that's not been tuned before, is actually very tricky, because quite often they're not very well in tune. Quite often the trebles are very sharp, and you think, well, if I make the new trebles even sharper, people are going to complain. So you end up doing a compromise of sort of leveling them off. But it's better if they're out of tune to tune the ring as well. You're going to get a much more satisfactory result.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating that obviously it's only very recently we've got the technology to record bells into the tower and to analyze the spectrum. So what particularly amazed me about your talk, and I hadn't known, was in the Netherlands, you know, in the 17th century, they perfected harmonic tuning. I mean, that's miraculous, isn't it?
Yes, it was. I think considering the technology available at the day, they did extremely well. I mean, they pushed technology up to its absolute limit, and they came up with some very, very creative ways of dealing with that problem. They had a treadle lathe for tuning small bells, and then, of course, they had the capstan lathe for tuning large bells. They developed their resonating chime bars for correcting the harmonics. They had their own pitch standard. So what they did, of course, is that they simply tuned their new bells to a set of bars. And they only had the one pitch standard. Their problem was if they were going to add bells to an existing set, that it was going to be difficult. And it was actually it was easier for them to bring the bells back and retune them to their own pitch standard.
Yeah. But I mean, that's quite phenomenal. I didn't know about that at all. But you're saying they had a lathe then, so they developed a lathe. It wasn't hammer and chisel round.
No, it had a proper machine where they could cut the bell right down into the crown.
That's phenomenal. And the other question I've got, I mean, this is maybe my complete lack of knowledge, but my assumption about the partials of the bells was that the hum, which is the lowest partial, isn't it?
Yes.
I thought that was primarily developed around the lip of the bell, where the bell is wider and thinner and a lower note. But what you're saying about where you have to tune the bell to affect the hum, that can't quite be the right picture of the physics of it.
No, it's the waist of the bell that determines the hum. So if you have a narrow-waisted bell, the hum is sharp. And if you look at that picture, the Anzac Bell, it has a broad waist, which gives the bell an octave hum.
So it's not the wider, thinner part of the bell, which is that lip. I mean, that isn't developing that low note.
No. If the sound bow is the strike note bit, and the fundamental is the crown bit.
And then in the between, you've got the hum.
That's right. You've got the hum, and also the fifth. The fifth is in between the fundamental and the hum.
Yeah. But as you say, there's an ohm overlap, so they all affect each other too.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
And of course, the other problem that bell founders had in this country, which Low Country people avoided, was when you're producing, say, a ring of 10 or 12, of course, the bells are not scale models. If you'd gone to the Heminges for a ring of 8 with a ton tenor, they would have given you a 48-inch tenor and a 24-inch treble. So the tenor would weigh a ton, and the treble would weigh about 2 3/4 hundredweight. So it would be far too weak to ring a bell. So the problem that bell founders in this country had to get around was to make thick scale bells. And that caused a lot of headaches when they were developing harmonic tuning, because they could produce a shape which gave you a harmonically tuned bell, but as soon as you started to thicken it up, it went out of tune. And they eventually discovered that the only way to put the fundamental in tune was to put about 3 times as much metal in the crown as you did on the sound bow. And they learnt that the hard way. So a lot of the early harmonically tuned trebles have flat fundamentals because they were learning that you're having to add enormous amounts of metal in the crown. And if you ever look at thick trebles in 12, if you look inside them, you'll see what looks like a donut in the bottom. You've got this huge, thick metal in the corner, and then of course it drops down into the bolt pad in the center. But that was one of the battles that English bell founders had, which the Low Country people just avoided.
Yeah, sure. Wow.
Thank you. I can see there's a question from Carol and Ronnie. I can see a hand going up. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Nigel, thank you. It's been extremely interesting. When they're being tuned, they seem to be upside down, they're inverted.
Yes.
When you're tuning, is it like a ceramic potter's wheel? Is it turning to taste? And,
yes, the machine revolves.
And how much are you taking away? Is it just absolutely microns, or is it quite a big piece? Because I mean, if you're making a pot and you take away, you can lose your pot, and it can just be ruined. So is it minute what you're taking away?
Not initially. If you've got a modern bell and it's cast, say, a tone sharp, initially you'll take quite heavy cuts. You might take off 4 millimeters at a time.
Really? That much?
Yeah, that much. But as you get towards the bell being tuned, then you start taking off very, very light cuts. And you might start by taking long cuts right the way from the shoulder of the bell up to the lip. And of course, at the end, you're cutting in little bands. You take a little bit off the salvo, a bit off the waist, bit off the upper waist, bit down in the crown. And you might only be taking 0.5 mil off.
But that then is experience on somebody like yourself. But
yes.
But I mean, hopefully there are people coming through and learning these skills. But
there are.
How do you know how much to take off? I mean, could you ruin the bell? Could you do something?
You can. You could ruin a bell if you take too much off. It's not like tuning a piano or a harpsichord where you can turn the key both ways.
Yeah.
It's really a one-way journey.
Can you? No, that's right.
No, you can drag some of the partials back up again to a limited extent. But if you were to take far too much off, let's say the bell was 30 hundredths of a semitone flat of target, well, that's it. You've got a choice. If you've got a complete ring, you can retune all the others to a new pitch standard. And let's say you could do the same with an old ring. If you overcut one old bell, you could put all the other bells back on the machine and tune them down to a new pitch standard. And it has been done in the past, not by me, but it has been done. But if you're adding a treble, say to make 6, you overcut it, you could put it into stock. But the normal thing would be to break it up and make it again.
Yeah.
Nigel, could I just ask a technical question, because I'm a mechanical engineer myself. When you put the bell in the position to machine it and clamp it,
yes.
As regards concentricity, how good is the concentricity of the actual bell before you machine it?
Modern bells tend to be round. A lot of old bells are not. They're often quite lumpy, and all you can do is try and compromise and get all the high spots.
Yeah.
But you can soon tell, because once you've started machining the bell, especially if you do outside cutting, you can soon tell if you've got it right or not. And if you haven't, you simply undo the center bolt, adjust the bell slightly, tighten it all up again, and carry on.
Yeah, and have you sort of got figures in your head to what minimum wall thickness there is in certain areas? Then?
I do. I have formulae for that. Many years ago, I came up with this idea that a 4-foot bell should not have a crown thickness of under 25 millimeters, or let's say an inch. I mean, in fact, you can go beyond that. Some years ago, I was doing some maintenance at Banstead, which were a Johnstonate, and I took the ultrasound with me just out of curiosity. And the tenor, which is 21.5 hundredweights, it's a 49-inch bell in E flat. The thinnest point of the crown was 11.7 millimeters. So it's not even half an inch thick. And I was shocked. I thought this, I mean, it's 100 years old this year, this particular bell. So it's lasted, partly because the machining is very neat and it's a good casting. But it does explain to me why Oakham tenor failed quite spectacularly in 1923, when they were ringing up one Sunday morning and it just fell off its crown.
Yeah. So a thickness of a bell can be from a centimetre, just over a centimetre, to 2.5 centimetres, a thickness of somewhere on that wall thickness, between a centimetre and 2.5 centimetres. Is that right?
Yes. Obviously, it depends on, with larger bells, I mean, what you'll find is, let's say, something like Cheltenham. The tenor has probably got a salvo of about, I still think in inches for bells, 3 3/8. Okay? Yeah. The salvo is probably about 3 3/8, and the crown is probably about 1.5 inches. The treble has probably got a salvo of about 2 7/16, maybe 2.5. So it's thinner than the tenor, but proportionately it's very much thicker. And of course, the crown is probably at least 3 inches thick compared with the 1.5 inches of the tenor, because, as I said earlier, when you make thick scale bells, you have to disproportionately thicken the shoulders of the bells to get the fundamentals achieved.
But the one you were talking about, which was really thin, was only half an inch thick at one
Yes,
point.
it wasn't even half an inch thick. And it shouldn't. I mean, for a 49-inch bell, a 21.5 hundredweight bell should be much thicker than that. It should be at least an inch.
Yeah.
And I'm quite staggered that the thing has lasted, to be honest.
Nigel, just to the final from me, tooling wise, has that changed as machining tooling it?
The things that have changed over the years with tuning is that we've moved from high-speed steel to carbide tools.
Yeah, sure.
And we've moved from calibrated tuning forks to stroboscopic instruments, and now we use laptops. There's Bill Hibbert's Wavenel program, and there's Tuner, and there's various programs available which will give you all the partial tones. You hit the bell a few times, it records all the partials, it gives you the decay times, the amplitudes. The only thing it doesn't do is tell you where to cut the bell.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any hands going up anywhere? No, deafening silence. Well, I think all remains in that case then is to say thank you very much indeed to Nigel. That was absolutely fascinating, very informative, and
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. Quick advert for next week for the St. Mark's crowd. Anyone who's with us next week, we have a quiz. There are 3 rounds lined up from Andrew, Haynes, Janet, and Becca. You know, you have been forewarned, and I'm doing something on a desert island disc. We are also looking for some volunteers from the St. Mark's crowd for discs, locations, or books. Please email Becca for that. So thank you very much for this evening. Extremely enjoyable.
Good.
And I look forward to seeing you all soon at some point somewhere, possibly in a tower.
Well, I think we should thank Nigel for the talk, but also thank him for introducing this amazing concept of the exterior tuning, which you know, that's enabled so many horrible old bells to be rescued and brought in a beautiful tone, isn't it? So that's
yes,
that is a wonderful thing.
So an ongoing debate with the with faculty process, I know, around external tuning.
Yes,
but
sure.
Perhaps something for another evening.
And there is an argument that you still want some old-fashioned sounding bells around. You don't want a landscape necessarily of all kind of completely modern sounding bells. But
I'm inclined to agree. I think with some classic, heavier old style 8s, I would be inclined to still tune them old style.
All right. Yeah.
I have a list of towers I would like tuned.
Oh, right. Okay. Please send it.
The diocese and the faculty and the powers that be may disagree with me about it, but there you have it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
And I'll see you all soon.
Okay.
Yeah, cheers, everyone. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye then.
Bye.